but for those who know that they are sinners. Not for winners, but for losers. As I read this is a text that applies to the rest of us. Coffee is for closers. Jesus is for the rest of us. Now, I was invited to talk about success initially in this talk. And I decided that I would do better, in fact, to talk about failure, because it seems to me that failure is an experience that's more common to us and more difficult to talk about, and certainly more difficult to talk about in the open. Now, if success is anything like what success is, the picture of success that we see in the scene from this play, then this is absolutely nothing that the church recognizes as success. Because that picture is a world in which winners rise to the top and losers get left behind. Where coffee is for closers. But how does that square with a biblical understanding of success, which says, do nothing out of your selfish ambition or your vain conceit, but in humility think of one another as more important than yourselves. Now, obviously, in the scene that we've just watched, we're talking about a particular kind of success. We're talking about material success. But there's all sorts of other kinds of success, and particularly success that is about relationship and the way in which we feel connected in our lives to other people, to ourselves, to God, to the rest of the world. And that's interesting to me because as often as not, we feel failed in that, and as often as not, the church is there precisely to be there for us when we recognize that sense of failure. Now, I suppose at this point, as someone who is just over the ages of 20 and 30s that this group is organized for, slightly over. I'm supposed to tell you something like, at the end of life, you talk to people in their deathbed, in a hospital, or in a hospice, or in their homes. It's not how much money people fail to make that they regret. It's not their work hours that they regret. The things that they regret the most are the things that matter the most to them. And those things are inevitably relationship. I wish I'd spent more time with my children. I wish I had taken the time to speak to my brother after our parents died. I wish I had made peace with my ex-wife. Nobody ever says, I wish I had worked more, spent more hours in front of the computer, made more money. Now, you've heard that before, I'm sure. And you think, well, it's a cliche, and it is. But it's a cliche because it happens to be true. It happens to be the experience that we have time and again as we meet people at that point in their lives. So there are three things that I would like to highlight for us today in what I think is something we need in the church. And that is a theology of failure. And I think once we get comfortable with being able to face ourselves in the places where we fail, then we are, I think, in a better position to be lifted from those places of failure, to be put back together, reconciled to God, to others, to ourselves, and healed on our way to a success as a quality of life that we want to cultivate, and particularly in Christian life. So there are three things I want to say. And one is that failure seems to be a quality that's part of our everyday lives and something we all recognize one way or another. And so when God meets us, He meets us in failure. He meets us in those places of failure in our lives. That's number one. And number two is that God is there not simply to keep company with us in failure, but to lift us from that, to redeem us, to reconcile us, and to find new ways for us to be who we are in our relationships, in our sense of being connected, and in that sense successful in our lives. And number three is that God gives us one another in order to experience and openly have a sense of honesty about the way in which we find ourselves time and again people who are broken. God meets us in failure, God lifts us from failure, and God gives us one another to reconcile us and redeem us from failure. Now, I think the key text on that first point is Philippians chapter 2, where we get a picture of Christ, the Son of God, who meets us here in our human sphere, not as some triumphant superhero, but as a broken person, as someone who has made himself less than he is, precisely so that he can encounter us and meet us right where we are. Here's Philippians chapter 2, and the text that I'm referring to. You will have these texts, by the way, in a handout after the talk, or during the discussion. It says, "Now, Christ Jesus, although being in his very nature God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant by being made in human form. And so as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient even to the point of death, even to death on the cross." Now, the genius of this text is that it speaks of God in the ultimately in human terms, and ultimately in that experience of brokenness that we recognize, which is an experience of being ordinary, broken, and ultimately headed towards death. Here is God, who is the Son of God, who is God, with God in heaven, who condescends, who descends down to our level, who lets go of everything that makes him God and embraces everything that it means to be human. And it's on that level that he finds himself able to relate to us, to be one of us. And from that point, as he gives himself up to the cross, to relate to us. Now, the picture I like to think, or I sort of use for myself to make sense of this verse, is I don't know whether anyone skydives in this. This is a very diverse group. Has anybody been skydiving? You got one person. Any other skydivers? Oh my goodness, look at this. With 3-4 people. Is that on Facebook? Make sure you put it up there. You've been skydiving. Now, can somebody tell me, when you skydive, what sort of height do you skydive from? How many feet above ground level? About 12,000, something like that? 12,000 feet, that sounds about right? Regular flight level. And at what point does the parachute open? What point does the skydiver open that parachute? Okay, quickly. When you begin to see the earth coming towards you. Well, apparently, I've looked this up, apparently, at about 3,000 feet. So you've got about 8,000, 9,000, 8,000 feet of seeing that earth coming at you at great speed. And about 3,000 feet, you deploy your parachute and land safely to the ground. But here is Jesus, who descends from heaven, falling to earth, and about 3,000 feet above ground level. He doesn't open the parachute. In fact, he lets go of that parachute, just releases the pack. And he says, I want to feel what it's like to be ultimately broken as a human being. And from that position on the ground, splayed out, as he hits the ground, that's when he begins the work of getting to know what it's like to be human, what it's like to be broken, and from there to rebuild, to reconstruct, to mend together and put things back as they ought to be in God's eyes. So when God meets us, he chooses to meet us in that position of brokenness, in that position of failure, in that position in which he can relate to the rest of us. But God doesn't leave us there, and he is there to encounter and lift us ultimately from that brokenness. And I think firstly, by reconnecting us to himself as God, by allowing us to experience a sense of wholeness and recognition that God has come for us, that he has done that for our sake and in order to rescue us from our condition of brokenness.